Good evening, everyone. It's great to see everyone here. I'm Ivy Barsky. I'm the director and CEO of the National Museum of American Jewish History, and I'm thrilled to welcome you all here this evening for this fabulous collaboration and opportunity. I have just silenced my cell phone, so that's a reminder to all of you. I love seeing everyone take their cell phones out of their pockets to do the same. Thank you for doing that. You all have surveys and contact cards in your programs. We'd love for you to fill those out so that we can keep in touch with you and let you know about other programs you'll be interested in. Don't miss our special exhibition, Bill Graham and the Rock and Roll Revolution. You may think you're not interested in this exhibition, but I promise you, you are. It's a great exhibition. We are the only East Coast venue. It's a fabulous story, and there are some things you probably know about Bill Graham. You might know about the Fillmore in San Francisco and the Fillmore East in New York. You probably know about his promotion of the Grateful Dead and the Allman Brothers and Janis Joplin. And Live Aid here in Philadelphia with Larry Magid, who was on our stage last night. What you may not know about Bill Graham is that he came here having been orphaned in the Holocaust. He came, and when I say here, I mean the Bronx. He went to the Bronx when he was almost 11 and went into foster care. And from those very humble beginnings, coming here with literally nothing, absolutely nothing but the clothes on his back, basically on a kinder transport, stage managed the Rock and Roll Revolution. So it's a fabulous exhibition that I think you'll enjoy, and it will be here until the middle of January. So we are very thrilled to be working with the Foreign Policy Research Institute. This is our first partnership together, and we hope the first of many. Great to see their members and our members and lots of people with shared interests here together, and I want to thank our trustee, Sam Savitz, for getting us all together. He had a foot in both camps and was smart enough to have us come together. So thank you, Sam, for doing that. And I also want to acknowledge Charlotte Weinberg. Charlotte, a little wave, thank you. She's incognito there and smack in the middle of the hall. As you know, this evening is in memory of Carroll Weinberg and another person who had a very special relationship to both institutions, someone who we miss dearly, spent a lot of time in this very room with us, would never miss anything that we were doing, and so we miss him all the time, as I know the people in this room do. So thank you for letting us honor him tonight in this most appropriate way. Today we are thrilled to have with us Jeremy Black, professor of history at the University of Exeter in London and senior fellow at FPRI's Center for the Study of America and the West. To introduce him, I want to thank Alex Luxembourg, president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, for being here and to introduce our speaker this evening. Thank you.
Well, on behalf of FPRI, I would also like to thank all of you for joining us and thank the National Museum of American Jewish History for hosting this event. If you're not familiar with FPRI, it was founded in 1955 on the premise that a nation should think before it acts. It was good advice then, it remains good advice today. Our mission is to bring the insights of scholarship to bear on the foreign policy and national security issues facing the United States, and our method is to look at contemporary international affairs through the lens of history, geography, and culture. For if we do not understand the past, we cannot understand the present, much less the future. As Ivy said, today we are honoring the memory of Carroll Weinberg. I got to know Carroll and Charlotte 25 years ago when they joined the Foreign Policy Research Institute, and I would have to give them A+ for attendance, since I think they came to virtually every program we've had over the past quarter of a century, and I would give Carroll A+ for participation, since I think he asked a question at every single program that he attended, sometimes giving a little speech, too. He also became an associate scholar of FPRI, where he focused on the psychological roots of terrorism and authoritarianism. He engaged many of our scholars, not just on an intellectual level, but on a personal level, as that was his way. And I think Carroll was what we call in the Jewish tradition a mensch, that is the highest compliment we can pay to another human being. Now we turn to our program this evening. I said to you that we look at everything through the lens of history, geography, and culture. Nobody does that better than our speaker tonight, Jeremy Black. As has been said, he teaches at the University of Exeter in Great Britain, and he is a senior fellow of FPRI. He's author of more than 100 books on military and diplomatic history, which probably makes him the most prolific historian in the history of the world. Today, we've asked him to speak on his new book, The Holocaust, History, and Memory. As it happens, that is also the subject of a very powerful new movie called Denial that is playing over at the Ritz 5 around the corner, about the famous libel suit brought by historian and Holocaust denier David Irving against historian Deborah Lipstadt, who had accused him of falsifying history. I recommend the movie. Jeremy's book is not a history of the Holocaust, it's a history of the histories of the Holocaust. It explores how we remember the Holocaust and how we misremember it. Please join me in welcoming Jeremy Black.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming along, and it's a great pleasure to meet many former people that I've met on other occasions, and I'd also like to say I remember Carroll, I remember him indeed asking some questions of me as a speaker. He was a man of great intellect, great humanity. His interest in psychotherapy and psychiatry reflected his genuine engagement with human beings as individuals, which I think for all of us, whether we're interested in the past or the present, is how we would want to be remembered. And as a historian, I always think that we should be concerned with our remembrance of the past. I can think of no better way to remember a great person than for him to be linked with a lecture series in which not only the past is looked at, but which his friends can come together and honour his memory. Now, the Holocaust. It is probably the subject that for all of us is one that is on the edge of reason. It is therefore a very difficult thing to think and to talk about. Equally, for those of us, all of us here are educated human beings, to, as it were, respond simply by saying it's beyond comprehension, or some other similar emotional response, isn't good enough. We owe to those people who were butchered, we owe to those of our forebears who suffered and those who knew those who suffered to actually apply our reason to it and to try and understand what happened. And as Alan said, for me, it was very important. I am Jewish personally, though I don't just think the Holocaust is something that only Jews should think about. For me, it's important, I felt at some stage, to write a book about the subject. It was in some respects tangential to my major work as a historian, but precisely the skills that one tries to develop as a scholar should be applied to the greatest questions, and I couldn't really think of a question greater than that. And what I want to try and do, I've only got a certain amount of time that I've been allocated, and I wish to leave time for questions. As Alan points out, there's a distinction between questions and speeches. I wish to leave time for questions, but I want, in the space available, to discuss both the events of the war, the Holocaust itself, and also I want to make some statements about the period since 1945. I can't obviously try and cover all countries, but I want to make some comments about some of the major points. And I also want to speculate, as I've tried to do in the book, as to how the Holocaust might be written about in 2050. For most of us, including myself, we will not be here then, but the point is we don't want the memory to cease and we don't want the importance to end. So let's just start as a historian. You might well say to me, surely it has been done to death. There is so much excellent scholarship on it. And I was interested in that remark about David Irving. One of the great problems if you're a historian is anybody can call themselves a historian. David Irving, of course, was no more a historian than I'm a plumber, in the sense he was a trained engineer who had an interest in the past. On the basis of that, he was called or called himself a historian. As I said, I try and mend the lavatories in my house. That doesn't make me a plumber. But if you're looking at it from the perspective of scholarship, I think there are ways in which in each scholar can look at the problems in new lights. And what struck me in particular is that I was rather dissatisfied with what one could say as the academic orthodoxy. The academic orthodoxy at the present moment is very much to locate the Holocaust in terms of German racialism and racism of the period. I think that very much underplays, and this is something I've tried to argue in the book, religious anti-Semitism. I think there is an important strand of religious anti-Semitism that is significant alongside the development of new theories of race in the period. Second of all, I think that the weight of the scholarship very much focuses on the extermination camps and the concentration camps. The two are different, as you know. There were some camps in which the only purpose of putting somebody in there was to kill them as swiftly as possible. Those were the extermination camps. The concentration camps, the intention in the long term was that everybody there should die, but in the meantime they were worked hard and they were not killed at once. So the temptation of most of the literature is to dominate it with Auschwitz II, the extermination camp at Auschwitz. I deliberately, on the front cover of the book, selected that very grim photograph of an Einsatzgruppe, an extermination group shooting Jews literally in the field, because one of the points that I tried to make in the book is that we tend to focus very much on the camps and we tend to underplay the very large number of Jews who were slaughtered in the fields, in other words, not in concentration camps, as the German armies advanced. And I use the phrase Germans, not Nazis. Too many people try and extenuate what the Germans did by referring to them as Nazis. Many Germans who killed people were not members of the Nazi Party. I think one has to be absolutely clear about this. And one also of the major themes of scholarship over the last 25 years has been to emphasize the role in the slaughter of the Wehrmacht as well as the SS. So it's a very dated view, the sort of view that too often still circulates, that the Holocaust was essentially a matter of transporting people to camps in railway carriages, slaughtering them there, the whole process overseen by the SS. That did happen, and it was terrible, and it's right to remember it. But it is by no means a complete account of the mass murder. And at least 1.5 million Jews were slaughtered not in the camps, and one needs to remember them. And in fact, it's interesting if you look at this geographically. The groups that were killed most in the field were, of course, people in the Soviet Union, particularly in 1941 and 1942, but it went on thereafter as well, but particularly as the Wehrmacht units advanced in 41 and 42. And there, the experiences of those communities tends to be underplayed. Another thing that I thought was underplayed and needed talking about much more was the role of Germany's allies. Some of Germany's allies acted a part which we would regard as relatively reasonable. Finland, for example, proved very resistant to handing over its Jews. It handed over 11 foreign Jews, disliked the fact that one of them got killed and demanded the other 10 back, and refused to hand over any of Finland's Jews, even though Himmler went along to demand them. So that was a relatively okay response. But if you look at Romania, for example, the Romanian capture of Odessa in 1941, and Odessa had one of the largest Jewish communities in Europe at that time, was followed by the mass murder of about 60,000 people. None of them were put in concentration camps. They were slaughtered there. Many of them were just shot, stabbed, burnt to death. And most of that killing, there were Germans present, there were Wehrmacht units present, but most of that killing was carried out by Romanians. And one needs to remember that part of the complexity of the Holocaust is to understand that it wasn't just Germans doing it, although they had the preponderant role in it, but there were others. And again, going back to this religious issue, what is very striking is that the religious dimension as to treating Jews as different and having, as it were, historic hatreds of them was particularly pronounced in many of the Allied countries, in Croatia, in Hungary, in Romania, in Slovakia. And religion was a very dynamic role in the slaughter there. I mean, the dictator of Slovakia, Tiso, was in fact himself a Catholic priest. So this idea that we can just present it as a sort of Nazi racist thing is, I think, very misleading. It's part of the way in which after the war, and as Alan said, one of the things we need to think about is how it was looked at after the war. Part of the process after the war is, of course, the reputation of the Catholic Church was on the whole sanitized. On the whole, the Catholic Church playing a prominent role in the Cold War against the Soviet Union and the other communist dictatorships, was not really given the critical reading that really should have been applied to it. And I think that's something that still to this day people are a bit chary of looking at hard. They focus in particular on the Pope of the period without thinking about the broader pattern of Catholic behaviour. Now, looking at the situation after the war is interesting because there are very different narratives of and about the Holocaust after the war to the present day, and its positioning in history and politics of countries varies enormously. Part of the issue is directly the question of the conduct of people during the war. So if you're looking at France, where, for example, the Front National, which is still an active force in French politics, and Marine Le Pen is hoping to be the next president, the Front National looked back to Vichy as, on the whole, a positive force, and therefore didn't really like talking about Vichy's role in handing over large numbers of Jews to be slaughtered. And in fact, Marine Le Pen's father, who founded the Front National, was an active Holocaust denier. I thought of describing Holocaust denial as mad, but that, of course, is a calumny on the insane. It's very unfair to describe the insane by associating them with Holocaust deniers. I think the phrase evil is what is a more appropriate one. If you look at France, though, you see very interestingly the way in which it is much more complex thinking about the Holocaust than simply to think in terms of what happened during the war. It goes roughly like this, and I focus on France first. We could do the same thing for pretty well every country, looking at the complexities of this. After the war, the emphasis was on the idea that all of the French had been resistors, apart from a few marginal characters who had collaborated. And the idea, therefore, was that those brutalized by the Germans were part and parcel of a broader resistance pattern. So that the French government, both the government of the Fourth Republic and the government that came in with de Gaulle of the Fifth Republic, was not really keen to emphasize the role of Jewish suffering. And you can see that, for example, in the war memorials that were put up, in fact, memorial to the deportation of those people to the concentration camps, which very much emphasizes not Jews. So that was very much the picture in the 50s and 60s. In the 70s, there started to be a greater engagement with what had happened under Vichy. And that then played through into politics, and in a rather surprising way, because the people who extenuated Vichy were not just the far right, the Front National and their progenitors, the descendants of the Action Française, but also, ironically, the Socialist Party of François Mitterrand, who became president, of course, in 1981. Mitterrand himself had started off as a civil servant under Vichy. He then manufactured an acceptable war story about what he'd gone on doing, but he was friends personally with a lot of senior former Vichy figures, and indeed, once a year, as president, used to go and put a wreath on the tomb of Marshal Pétain. The result, therefore, was this, that in the late 80s, 1990s, to talk about the handing over of the Jews was to actually make critical remarks about the president. And those remarks were most critically made by Chirac and the Gaullists, who wanted to argue that there was an honest French tradition, that this was an honest tradition of the right, which was different to that of the Front National. They also wanted to make political capital by attacking Mitterrand. And indeed, as you may know, as soon as Mitterrand stops being president and Chirac becomes president, and Chirac before that had been mayor of Paris, you start to get large numbers of memorials to the sufferings of the Jews. So if you go around Paris, I mean, I first went around Paris, I think, in the late 60s, and I did archival work there from the late 70s on. There was absolutely nothing really about the treatment of the Jews in those years. But if you start going around in the 1990s, you start seeing outside the schools in Paris phrases going, you know, such and such a number of children were rounded up in 1942 and sent to Auschwitz. And those were being put up by the office of the mayor under Chirac, and then subsequently by Chirac as president, partly because Chirac believed it was genuinely wrong what had happened under Vichy, and there's no doubt that he was motivated by a genuine sense of anger. And I think for all of us, it's the treatment of the children that is most awful, but partly because he was motivated by a genuine sense of anger, and partly because he wanted to say, you know, this man Mitterrand, he is a total shit of the first order. I hope that was captured by the television cameras. Mitterrand, a total shit of the first order, okay? He wanted to capture that. Now, that is very much the French portrayal, and interestingly, it plays through in a whole host of ways. It plays through in the disagreements in the 2000s between Sarkozy and the left as to how you should treat the war years. It plays through in a whole host of ways. Other countries, the same. Let's look at Eastern Europe, where, after all, the slaughter was most intense. In Eastern Europe, the communist regimes, which essentially ruled from just after World War II until the fall of the Iron Curtain in 1989, the communist regimes did not really wish to focus on the suffering of the Jews. Number of reasons for that. One, the standard communist argument was that all, whether it was Poles or Czechoslovaks or Romanians or Bulgarians or whatever, had suffered in common. So that therefore, if you read a Polish history book of the 1980s, they would tell you 7 million Poles were killed. They wouldn't, in concentration camps, they wouldn't once mention that that was an exaggeration because, of course, the number was largely Jews, and it's under 6 million in Poland because, of course, there are more than 1 million elsewhere. But anyway, they were talking about that. They were not in any way discussing the specific tribulations of the Jews. That was point number one. Point number two, there was a high rate of anti-Semitism on the left in the communist years. There'd been a large number of Jews who had been communists, but they get purged quite conclusively in the late 40s, early 50s in Czechoslovakia, in Hungary. Of course, Stalin has the so-called doctor's plot in order to purge Jews in the Soviet Union. In Poland, you get large-scale anti-Semitism developing within the Communist Party. So there's that as part of the element, and also part of the element is anti-Israeli politics becomes very important as well. So you get an enormous downplaying of the suffering of Jews during the communist years. After the communist years, you then get a much more complex pattern. On the one hand, you often have right-wing clerical nationalists coming forward who in many senses look back to the wartime collaborators with Hitler and treat those people as, quote, true patriots. So, for example, Marshal Antonescu, who was the military dictator of Romania during World War II and, who was shot by the Soviets after the war. Jolly good thing he was shot. And he personally was very much linked to the slaughter of Jews by Romanians. He becomes somebody who is regarded by right-wing Romanians, particularly of a clerical disposition in the 1990s, as a good thing. And the same, of course, in countries like Lithuania, Slovakia, and so on. So that is one tradition, and that presents a different aspect of Holocaust diminishment, or the argument that there were lots of people killed by lots of different sides, and why should you put the emphasis on the slaughter of Jews? That's the argument you get from right-wing clerical nationalists. On the other hand, you get on the left wing of the political spectrum, you get people who look back to the same argument of the communists, who are embarrassed at the idea or dislike the idea or are opposed to the idea that there should be any discrimination between people, any differentiation between people who are Poles or Romanians or Slovaks or whatever, and that therefore you shouldn't write about the Holocaust from that point of view. So in other words, I think it's fair to say that there is still an ambiguous and difficult history about the Holocaust in Eastern Europe. It varies, but you can go to Eastern European cities. I can tell you this about Vilnius, for example, where you will find, which had been a great Jewish centre, great centre of learning, very populous area, where quite frankly there isn't very much of an interest in Vilnius, unless they think they can milk some money out of American tourists who might be sympathetic, but there's not much of an interest in discussing it. It varies depending upon where you go in Eastern Europe, but one of the really quite troubling ones is these sort of places of silence, places that were ghettos, where there was a lot of slaughter, where these days there's either no memorialization at all, or the most vague and unsatisfactory one. And you can see that quite a lot, although what is more common is that, in fact, the ghettos were often just bulldozed out of existence during the communist years. If you're looking further afield, you start to get, we're not talking about the United States, you're well aware of it, but you'll start to get, if you're looking outside Europe, you start to get an even more complex or unsatisfactory account. I think it's fair to say that in the Islamic world, the account of the Holocaust from our point of view, and the point of view of anybody who is rational, is one that is truly disturbing. You get, as in Malaysia, for example, where they refuse to allow Schindler's List to be broadcast, you get a process of denial. You get an argument that in some way this is just one of a large number of massacres. You get ludicrous attempts to argue some sort of equivalence with the policies of the State of Israel, which is ridiculous. There is no equivalence at all. And you get a sort of wholesale process of denial. More interesting, in a sense, is what the position is if you're looking in China, or if you're looking in Japan, or if you're looking in India. And the accounts there are significant, because if we're thinking ahead to what the Holocaust might look like in 2050, it is reasonable to point out that the populations of China and India constitute about a third of the world's population at the moment, that the area of the world where the population is growing most rapidly is sub-Saharan Africa, and if you put those together, you are putting together places where the essential narrative is not one to have much of an interest in the Holocaust at all. And indeed, I think I could push that a stage further. My own view, for what it is worth, is that by 2050, the Holocaust will primarily be an account which you see in the history offered by historians in North America and in Europe, but it doesn't really feature very much elsewhere. I've been to Japan to lecture on 3 occasions, and it's hard enough getting them to look seriously at World War II. I once innocently enough mentioned, I was asked to lecture on the causes of war at Scuba University, and I innocently enough, I didn't mean to be difficult. I mean, if I want to be difficult, I'll be difficult. But I innocently enough said, very few wars began with an unprovoked attack by one power on another, as happened at Pearl Harbor, whereupon 2 women just got up and walked out, which I thought was a little unsatisfactory. The Japanese are not really interested in the Holocaust. I think it's fair to say. For them, of course, they have their own notion of victimhood, which is a rather bizarre one. In other words, they put all the emphasis on the atomic bombs and rather leave out of the kilter what they did as occupying powers in places like Java or the Philippines, and the horrors they enforced. So they have this kind of notion of focusing on themselves. They also, I think it's fair to say, don't wish to irritate Islamic states, and that constitutes part of their response, but they say very, very, very little about it at all. Ditto in China. In China, it does not, I'm not saying it's never mentioned, but it plays very, very little role in textbooks at all. And I think, from our point of view, regarding the Holocaust as it should be regarded as a matter not only of great importance, but also as a central moral question, how, as historians do, or as people in civil society, do we discuss an episode like that? How do we understand it? How do we account for it? Whether, as I've said, people are Jewish or not, it should be important for everybody as a common memory of the past, how one thinks about it. It is then very peculiar to go to places where it simply is not there in the historical record, or it is completely ignored. I mean, as you are probably aware, if you you look at a Chinese book, or you go and listen to the Chinese talking about World War II, World War II is all about how the Communist Party was validated by standing up against the Japanese. Forget the fact that most of the fighting was done by the nationalists. Forget the fact the Americans may have been fighting the Japanese as well. I don't know about that. If you're Chinese, you may not believe that. But, forget any other aspect of the war. It is the way in which the CP, the Communist Party, validates itself. That is the central narrative of World War II. In India, the central narrative of World War II is about its role in the developing of Indian nationalism and the imminent collapse of the British Empire. Again, no interest really in the Holocaust. So what one has got is that the politicization, which has always existed, but which is very acute in a world in which, despite everybody believing in the future, they validate their societies through reference to the past and through historical myths of empowerment and grievance, that context means that the Holocaust doesn't mean very much in Asia or in Africa, or indeed really, apart from in areas with Jewish communities, in South America. It is much more partial in its extent. Last aspect, before we take a few questions and I make some general reflections. Last aspect, in all my reading on it, the thing that interested me the most was not how people manufacture the past. I'm used to that. That's part of the job, how people create and how the gaps, the silences of the past and how they look at the past, how they invent legends. As I said, the legend that the Wehrmacht had a clean war is a good example of that. What I found most interesting is from the word go, for both Jewish and non-Jewish theologians and other commentators who were not explicitly theologians, it's the attempt to address the Holocaust from the point of view of what its meaning would be in a world which is either theistic, religious, or a world which is not religious but which has a set of values. And in a sense, there is alongside the kind of what I've been talking about, which is how historians interrogate the past, how politicians construct it, how we all create memories, all of which is important, nothing wrong with that, that's normal. Alongside those issues, there is the fact that the Holocaust is one of the few episodes in history, I can't think of any to the comparable extent, which has called forth the energies, the thought of both religious and non-religious commentators. And that itself is really an interesting aspect of it. Most of the writing on the Holocaust is from the secular perspective. Nothing wrong with that. But it's also interesting to look at spiritual engagement with it. It's for those of us who are Jewish, it's very interesting to see the very different ways in which Jewish commentators have tried to derive some sort of meaning from it and how they have confronted it. And it's also interesting, actually, to see how non-Jewish commentators, both religious and not, have the extent to which they've addressed it and the extent to which they haven't. So if I could make some general conclusions and then we could have some comments. First, the Holocaust is not something just located in the 1940s, in the years of World War II. It is because of the enormity of it, because of the centrality for Western thought, for the centrality not just for Jews but for non-Jews as well, and also because of its important role in the history of a number of major states, as well as a number of minor ones. It is a living part of the past, and it is living in the extent that people think about it. The very fact that so many of you are here tonight indicates your sense that it is part of your civic purpose of coming together, is to actually think about an episode like that and how one should discuss it. And this is not a question in which I have the right answers and nobody else does. Everybody has views that are worth listening to on a topic like that. So the Holocaust is part of the way in which history is not just what happened in the past, it is also how we create accounts of what happened in the past. Now that is a central aspect of history. It is absurd to imagine that history is something that is independent of our views. But at the same time, that does not mean it is just a matter of opinion. Going back to Alan's point about, David Irving, it is not just a matter of opinion. Things happened. I was sitting at some dinner party, actually a dinner of doctors, and listening to my neighbour telling me that all history was as a matter of opinion, etc., etc. I got fed up after a bit. And I just turned to her and I said, it's like this. You can say to me that China bombed Pearl Harbor in 1940, and I can tell you it was Japan in 1941. And after that, I just turned to my other neighbour. There was no point really getting on with that comment. So in other words, there are things that happen. It is not just a matter of opinion. Holocaust deniers or diminishers are fools. Many of them are evil. At best, they are idiots. Although, again, as I've said, that's a calumny on the insane. But how we perceive something tells us a lot about how we are as individuals and which society we are in and what we want to get from it. I mean, as you were probably aware, if you'd gone to Israel in the 50s and looked at the Holocaust, you will be aware that many Israeli Jews were very uncomfortable about the Holocaust because they felt that this was a wrong memory for Israel, because they felt that the Jews had not made enough of an effort, not much they could have done, incidentally, but not made enough of an effort in Eastern Europe, and they preferred to look back to Masada and the wars against the Romans and fighting to the death as the historical record they wanted. So it's not just a question of minimizing it from from, anti-Semitic perspectives. There are all sorts of complexities. But the last aspect of the memory of history and memory that I think we ought to focus on is simply this. Alongside history as events that occurred, and alongside history as our accounts of events that occurred, there is the third dimension of history, and that is the trust between the generations, the sense that we should understand, honour, try and appreciate what happened to predecessors, just as we would hope that those who came after us will do the same for us. Now, for those of us who are Jews, there is something particularly important that we do that for the generation that went through the Holocaust. Whether they themselves suffered personally, and most who did died, or whether they actually suffered from understanding what was happening. And in a way, our memory should be even stronger for those who did not have children in order to memorize them. So I think if I'd like to close, it will be on the moral point that there is a necessity in this matter to have a collective memory. Thank you very much.
Jeremy is the only person I know who can speak in paragraphs without breathing in between paragraphs. We have a couple of people with microphones roaming the room, so wait till the microphone comes to you and speak directly into the microphone.
Hi. So as you're talking about these nations and continents that don't really remember or talk about the Holocaust anymore, as a historian and looking into the future, how do we redirect that conversation and have these people who don't really think about it think about it?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I don't actually hold up much hope for I think the idea of a united world view of the past is a fallacy. I'm not saying that you're offering that fallacy, I'm just simply saying it is a fallacy. It's part of that kind of universalism that developed in the late 40s, linked to the United Nations, and then wandered forward, this idea that if everybody was reasonable, we'd all share the same set of values. It's not going to happen like that. It really isn't. So I think what we have to be aware of is instead that there are different public histories, as well as different private histories, and those different public histories contrast so greatly that we've often got a completely different frame of reference. That's why people don't understand us. Often it's why we don't understand them. I mean, let me give you a clear example of that. You might think, I certainly think, that it is slightly bizarre when you had Osama bin Laden that he was tremendously worried about regaining Al-Andalus for Islam. Now, Islam lost Al-Andalus, Andalusia, they call it Al-Andalus, depending upon which bit of Al-Andalus you're looking at, but they lost it in the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries, a long time ago. But there are some people whose chronological memory, whose geographical memory, whose sense of grievance are very different to ours. And we just have to accept that. Doesn't mean they're all of equal right. I think they're completely crackers, these views. But what we have to accept is that, in other words, don't believe that everybody's view is of equal validity. That's an absurdity. That's the kind of ludicrous cultural relativism of, the world we live in. But what we have to understand is that there are differing views out there. And, I don't think you're going to find a world in which the Chinese, the Indians, or the Japanese are particularly bothered about the Holocaust. And interestingly enough, in many contexts, the Holocaust has been debased as a word because it is now used to describe any particular thing that you don't like. So I occasionally keep a tab of this. I recently noticed some idiot in Britain referring to a Holocaust of badgers. That's because the government is trying to have a cull of badgers because they cause bovine tuberculosis among the cattle. Now, you may have your own views on it, but I actually think that's a fairly disgusting comparison of a phrase like that. But the word has been debased by its very use in that kind of fashion.
Thank you very much for this talk. I found it excellent. I think you touched on the appropriate points. It was an excellent summary of the state of our knowledge on this. One thing that it seems to me you didn't touch on, and that is the role of the individual. In particular, I think what is disturbing to many people who think about the Holocaust seriously is the role of the figure of Hitler in energizing and perverting the course of European history. And to what extent this Jew hatred, which you, I thought very well described as just wandering around out there for different kinds of people to pick up at the time appropriate for them, to what extent that can become powerful enough to do real damage to human beings, and how we might, how we can live our lives with the knowledge of that threat and what we can do to minimize it. Because for all the hatred that existed, for all of the religious anti-Semitism, without the spark of National Socialism and the figure of Hitler, I think it's pretty well accepted the terrible things that took place in Europe in the 1940s would not have happened.
Right, thank you. Yes, I'm glad you used the phrase Jew hatred, because I think that is exactly the correct phrase to use for describing the attitude there. And that, of course, nicely avoids trying to put the focus on either the racial or the religious side. It's both. I think particular circumstances, both in terms of Hitler's attitudes, but also in terms of the specific details of what happens in 39, in 40, in 41, and in 42 are all important. I mean, it's no accident, as you know. They conquer Poland in September 1939. The conquest of Poland is accompanied by the slaughter of about 10,000 Jews, but the mass murder of Jews doesn't happen for at least, depending upon which city you're talking about, at least another year and a half on in that in Poland, and in some places, Krakow, you're talking about closer to 3 years afterwards. So yes, I agree with you. Circumstances and individuals play a big role in triggering what happens. I would, though, also say that I think that it can work, Hitler can energize it precisely because there are strong anti-Semitic strands that he can call upon. I think that's what I would really draw attention to. I mean, after all, if there hadn't been strong strands of anti-Semitism, it's probable that the response in some of the areas that cooperated and collaborated would have been much less. And I think that it's rather interesting, as you may know, if you look at individual countries, if you contrast, say, Belgium and the Netherlands, or Romania and Bulgaria, you get very different responses to instructions from German occupiers or German allies, in the case, depending upon which of those examples you're looking at, and that reflects circumstances there. So it's not just, I mean, a dictatorship, there's a naive view about dictatorship. I'm not saying you've got to know, but there's a naive view of dictatorships that the dictator presses a button and that something happens over there. That no more happens in a dictatorship than anywhere else. Unless you've got a secret policeman who's honest in the sense of doing what the government wants at everybody's elbow, things don't happen like that. So I think Hitler is very important, but I think he can operate because anti-Semitism is so strong, including in much of German society as it has developed from the 1880s, 1890s. Blood and soil nationalism becomes very potent before World War I. It's then obviously taken further as a result of the experience of defeat in the war and also because of anti-communism. So those all play a role. But blood and soil nationalism is already there's already anti-Semitism in quite a big way before World War I, same as in Russia, of course. The big pogroms start off before World War I. So the tendency to blame it all on World War I and Europe was all dandy before that, I think one's got to be a little, I'm not saying you're doing that, I think one's got to be a little more careful on that one.
Thank you, Jeremy. As you know, I'm a Frenchman.
Yeah.
And I was particularly moved by your comments regarding the effects of the Holocaust in France. I was particularly impressed by your very thorough, broad condemnation of the Catholics. But I wonder what place you would leave for those exceptions, such as the people responsible for running the Collège du Cambon and the shelter they offered.
Oh, I'm not denying,
children.
I'm not saying that
Hold on, it's not over.
No, you're making a speech. I'm not saying that all,
No, I'm not making a speech.
saying that all Catholics were anti-Semitic, just as I wouldn't say that all post-war communists were anti-Semitic. What you have to do as a historian is to look at two things. One, what groups have tended to be underplayed, all right? That's point number one, and I think that is a significant point. And two, where do you have subsequent, how should one put it? When you're trying to face the diversity of things, where should you put the emphasis? Now, there's lots of things I haven't focused on. I haven't focused on the fact that the gentleman over there asked for the role of individuals. I thought when he was going to ask that, he wasn't going to talk about Hitler, he was going to talk about a pleasant aspect of individuals, which is that under occupation, some people, including in France, including Catholics, risked their own lives to give shelter to Jews, which is great. It's marvelous. They showed the true courage of individuals in often a really horrible situation. You can then look at the true horror of individuals, that many of the people who were picked up by the Gestapo were not picked up by the Gestapo because of its efforts. The Gestapo was in many senses a rather vicious bunch of Keystone cops. They were betrayed to them. So brilliant, as you may know, I don't know if you know this, most Gestapo records were destroyed in 1945, but the records survived for one or two areas, particularly for around Saarbrücken. And one of the interesting things there is it shows that the Gestapo fundamentally is responding to information. So people write in, not just to say their neighbour is a Jew, often wasn't a Jew incidentally, but often just to say that, you know, so-and-so, because they don't like so-and-so, is spreading nasty or seditious remarks. So the Gestapo sends somebody, if they can be so minded, to beat them up and see if there's any truth in this. But the sad truth, the good truth, is that the sad truth is that people responded as individuals, including Catholics. But all I'm saying is that institutionally, what strikes me is if you're looking, and I specified Hungary, Croatia, Slovakia, all of which were, you know, as it were, Catholic polities. That's how the Horthy regime conducted itself in Hungary. That's how the Tiso regime conducted itself in Slovakia. These were Catholic nationalist places. They were quite happy to just slaughter their Jews. They were quite happy to do so. And what's interesting is the variety and the variation between groups. That, you know, the Germans are in occupation, either directly or not, allied or not, or with much of Europe. Not of all of Europe, but of much of Europe. The variations between how people respond is really striking. And again, I would agree, there are vicious and nasty anti-Semitic Protestants. There were people that behaved badly in Norway or Denmark. You won't find very many Catholics in Norway or Denmark. But on the whole, what strikes me is that the conduct of the Catholic Church was particularly baleful. And I'll just make a simple point, that clerics tend to conduct themselves They all went to their churches with paintings of martyrs of the past. Very few Catholic clergy were willing to be martyred in the 40s. Forget about for Jews who were Jews. For Jews who had converted to Catholicism, most of them weren't willing to do anything. And I so happen to think that's disgusting. You can extenuate it any way you like. I think it's disgusting. Next.
Oh, thank you. First of all, I want to thank you very much for this very stimulating and insightful presentation. In particular, I'm interested in the present and the future because that's a major orientation of your discussion. And there is a phenomenon going on in Poland right now, in Warsaw, with the recent opening of the 1,000 Years of Jewish History Museum that's there, that has many Polish national millennials, if you will, each day going through, hundreds, in addition to many outside Jewish people, of course, coming to see that. So my question is, given the role it's playing and given the accuracy and the openness of the discussion, how do you see that playing out as another kind of exemplar for the 2050 point that you were making?
Well, I certainly hope it does. I mean, as you know, in both Poland and Hungary at the moment, you've got nationalist governments who are, how should one put it? They are old, in some respects, old-fashioned blood and soil governments. It's to be hoped that they can maintain a diverse approach to the different religious traditions in their country. So, for example, in the case of Poland, it's not just the Jews, it's the Protestants. There was a Protestant, tradition there. It was largely destroyed, for want of a better word. Things like the Thorn Massacre in 1724, which you wouldn't have heard about because that was a killing of Protestants. But it's to be hoped that the Polish government has grown up. As you say, that museum's there. The museum was actually instituted under its predecessor, which was more, shall we say, liberal in its values. I worry, I think in Europe, what worries me is that the continent is in economic crisis, including my own country. I'm not excluding that from it. And in that context, with wage rates depressed, with people anxious about immigration, in that context, the standard bogeyman at the present moment, to a certain extent justified in some cases, is obviously the fundamentalist Islamic. Not all Muslims are fundamentalists for a second, but it is the fundamentalist Muslim. But one wonders and worries that they will become more extensive in their prejudice, both against moderate Muslims and against Jews and against anybody else they don't like. So there is that degree of anxiety as to how Europe will look when you're looking at these nationalist states. You see, your nationalism is very unusual. Your nationalism is a construction around the idea that you come to America, you become an American, and it doesn't matter what you were before or what your origins are, what your religion is, or what, in fact, your personal living tradition is within your family or memory. It doesn't matter. If you're an American, that's fine. That's great, that's wonderful, but it's not the nationalism that pertains in most of the world. And that's why I think it's quite difficult for Americans to understand how pernicious nationalism can be in many countries. Now, having said that, it's often difficult to know what the alternative is. You need some sense, if you live in Hungary, as to what it means to be a Hungarian, but unfortunately the sense often is far too narrow and far too aggressive towards those who you might think do not match your perceptions.
As a daughter of Holocaust survivors, I was curious as to what your advice or your thoughts were as to personal memory. As we go forward, second and third generation are now speaking for our parents. and grandparents. So I was just thought of that. And also I will add that there were some wonderful nuns in a convent in France that saved my mother.
Good. As far as the question about how to record a memory, we've now actually got far more mediums than existed in the past, which is good. I would make, if I was you, as many different media to record this as possible. And I would upgrade it every time you feel you need to upgrade it. I mean, to give you an idea, I used to edit, one of my many things, the Journal of the British Records Association, the Journal Archives. And I remember our sister journal, the Journal of the Society of Archivists, arguing that one of the great problems with digital forms is that most people assumed that digital forms would last forever. They argued that archives, now archives have a different demand pattern and a different public responsibility to private individuals, but they argued that archives ought to remaster all their material onto new hard drives every 10 years. Okay? So in other words, you should record a lot, you should do it in different media, you should distribute it among members of the family so that you don't just have one person do it, and then you need to regularly remaster it in some form or other. And one of the easiest ways to do that is to make fresh stuff each time. Okay? And can I just say, I'm not doubting that lots of people acted in good ways. All I'm saying, my difficulty as a historian, forget about the Holocaust for a second. Let us say, well, I'll give you an example. One of the recent books I've written is on Britain since 1945, which I've had to write for the University of Indiana. They want, you know, for a British academic to write about the crisis now and look at, you know, how we've got to Brexit. So you've got the difficulty. How do you try and summarize the experience of 65 million people in 100,000 words? You inevitably have to make choices, and inevitably somebody is going to say to you, well, that doesn't describe the situation in Scunthorpe, to which the answer is, yes, I know that, but what I'm trying to do is look at generalities.
We have time for one more question? We have a question right here. This is a former summer intern at FPRI student at the Baldwin Academy.
Well, thank you very much for the talk. I'm very excited to be here. I had a question about defining personal motivations in Nazi Germany. In other words, how do we look at whether people were acting more out of anti-Semitism or whether they were acting out of personal motivation for their career? And also, does the way we regard personal motivation change from country to country?
Again, that's an excellent question. All of these questions are very interesting, actually. As you will know, there's an enormous literature on the motivation of people in the Third Reich, of which I think it's fair to say that the most distinguished scholar is an American, Christopher Browning. He's just retired at North Carolina, Chapel Hill, but he's not the only one. You know, books like Hitler's Willing Executioners and all the rest of it. Clearly, people acted for a whole host of reasons, which is exactly what you'd expect. Some people acted for ideological factors, some people acted because they thought they ought to, some people acted because they couldn't really be bothered to think about it, but they just did something. Group pressure was very important, particularly in the military. A lot of the accounts of the slaughter by the Einsatzgruppen makes the point that a lot of these people were drinking heavily when they were doing it. Doesn't extenuate it for a second, but it gives you an idea of their mental picture at the time. So I don't think that you can point to any one state of psychology and say this explains everything. The point I tried to make earlier is that many of the killers were not members of the Nazi Party. We shouldn't assume it's just Nazism that draws people into being mass murderers or small-time murderers. It also, I think, is the case that the argument that was made after the war by many Germans that they didn't really know what was going on is complete rubbish, is total rubbish. And again, it's very interesting. There's a lot of interesting work being done recently. I think Jill Stevenson's work I'm thinking of. The argument, the Nazis are starting to get people writing in 42, 43, as by which time there's virtually, Germany is declared Judenfrei by 43. But the argument that the Allied bombing is being set in place by Jews, Jews are directing Roosevelt and Churchill, and that means you've got to kill even more of them because they have to, they have to be punished for this. In other words, you've got all sorts of weird ideas circulating there within the German public. What I would argue is that the majority of people who acted did so not because they had to, that free will existed, and that in that context, their cooperation, their connivance, whatever form it took, whether it took the form just simply of seizing the possessions of people, whether it took the form of denouncing neighbours, whether it took the form of, applauding at newsreels, whether it took the form of just going to see anti-Semitic films, which were, whatever form it took, these people didn't have to do it. And in particular, if you were obviously if you were an active opposer, you would get into trouble and they'd kill you. But if you were a non-active opposer, nothing much happened to you. And what's really striking, I'm a military historian by background. What's really striking is the difference between the field marshals and the generals in 42 and 43. There were generals and field marshals who issued instructions, like Reichenau, for example, who issued instructions to the units under their command, ordering them, to get on and kill Jews. And there were other generals and field marshals who obviously thought this was a sort of rather vulgar thing and one shouldn't really get associated with this too much and leave that to the Einsatzgruppen. The second group were just as unpleasant, but at least they didn't personally feel that they needed to tell people that there was some sort of quota they needed to conform to. So I think that the response at every level indicates that people could make a choice. Unfortunately, the majority of them who were Germans chose in a way that we quite rightly, and as I said, I have no time for relative judgments. I think part of the job of a historian is to make, and it's a difficult thing because in the absence of a religious philosophy, and we don't live in a society anymore with a religious philosophy in Europe, but you needs to have some sense of secular morality. These people made wrong choices. Many of them individually were evil. They collectively were part of an evil system. There is no excuse possible by saying the economy was bad or they'd all been disrupted by World War I. This is just rubbish. People can have, free will exists. That's the condition of being a human being. These people did not exercise their free will in an appropriate fashion, period.
Thank you very much. The Holocaust is probably one of those subjects where you would think there's nothing new to be said. But I think Jeremy proved that there is always something new to be said. So we thank Jeremy for enlightenment and illumination. We thank the National Museum of American Jewish History and Ivy Barsky for hosting this program, Sam Savitz for bringing us together, and Charlotte Weinberg for making this possible. Thank you all for joining us, and we hope to see you back here and at our place sometime soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was great.
That was magnificent. Yep.